This is the story of the Crazy Quilt from Kershaw, South Carolina. Clouds mounted along the horizon while the sky turned an ominous and threatening yellow. All afternoon, the young couple had waited for the quilt to be auctioned off. It had no planned design, and most women called it a crazy quilt. Annette Larson had chosen it as a Christmas gift from her fiancé. Marble top tables, massive oak beds, china, and once loved familiar objects of a Midwest farm family went one by one to the strangers. It seemed to Annette that the auctioneer would never pick up the quilt. She and John knew this was tornado weather and they ought to be heading home. A tornado in the Great Plains country meant devastation for everything in its path and sometimes death. A patter of rain began to fall. Still they stayed on. John Gerber was a tall, shy young man with a kind way about him, and he really wanted Annette to have her heart's desire. Finally, the auctioneer held up the beautiful coverlet. He started it off at $10. John bid 15. 20, came a voice from the crowd. 25, called John. 30, signaled another bidder. Will anyone give me 35 for this fine quilt sure to bring happiness to a new marriage bed? The auctioneer smiled and waited. John raised a finger, and the quilt was his. It's very beautiful, said the young Amishman admiringly before he handed it to Annette. The quilt was a multitude of brilliant colors. Now it will be hers forever. Gusts of wind began to whip her skirt around her legs, and even before they reached the buggy, rain started to pour. Annette's hair hung in long, wet trindles about her face. Gerber whipped the horses, and off they galloped at a mad pace through the deluge. The girl grew even more pale as the wind rocked the buggy relentlessly as they rode. The sound of the wind increased until it became a roar around them, and suddenly there was a horrendous jolt. John Gerber felt his wagon lift off the ground and sail through the air. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then he lost consciousness. When he recovered, he was lying on the ground, and all was deathly still around him. Amazed, he seemed unhurt, and he picked up himself and looked for Annette. At first, all he saw were bits and pieces of the wagon and a shred of her shawl. Why didn't they leave earlier? Then, perhaps 100 feet away, he saw the brightly colored quilt. He walked over to where it lay upon the ground, stretched out almost as neatly as if it had been placed upon a bed. Dazed as he was, he could not help but notice its beauty at the time. But then he realized there's something beneath it. With a sense of terrible dread, he lifted a corner and exposed the lovely, still face of Annette. Tenderly, he turned down the bright coverlet and knelt beside his fiancée. One small, bruised hand clung tightly to the edge of the quilt. He called her name and finally shook her in an almost fierce gesture of rebellion, then cradled her body against him, only to have her head fall back limp. The girl, soon to have been his bride, was dead. It was 1955 when Dora Monroe and her husband of Kershaw, South Carolina, moved into the handsome old house on Matson Street. A Midwestern family had once lived there briefly, but then moved. Others had come and gone. Then Dora Monroe was one of those admirable women who prided themselves on meticulous housekeeping. The first thing she did was to give the place a thorough cleaning. When the rooms were painted and the floors were refinished and polished to her satisfaction, she decided on the first cool day to straighten up in the attic. She left one end of it untouched at the time that they moved. What a sight it was! There were nuts cached there by squirrels, rat droppings and cobwebs hanging from the rafters, and crumbling old newspapers along with the remnants of some broken toys. She was almost through when way back in a dark corner, almost hidden under the eaves, she spied something. It was a large cardboard box, and filled with curiosity, she tugged it out. A cloud of dust rose as she lifted the lid. Removing a layer of tissue paper, Dora Monroe was amazed to find one of the most beautiful handmade quilts she had ever seen. It must be at least 100 years old. It was a kaleidoscope of colors and in almost perfect condition. She immediately visualized it upon her guest room bed. A few months later, before her daughter Florence arrived for the summer, she thought of the quilt and spread it over the guest bed. Her neighbors, Nancy McHugh and Anne Fraser, looked at it with mingled admiration and envy. Florence arrived to visit her mother the first day of May, and after hugging her mother and chatting for a little while, she unpacked only her most needed toiletries and articles and took a nap. It was after midnight when she finally awoke. She was certain that her mother must be pulling on the covers and tucking her in, as she had once done when Florence was a child. But when she called out, "Mom," in the darkness, there was no answer, and she supposed that her mother had already left. Dozing off again, Florence was wakened once more, this time by tugging motions of the quilt, and reaching down, she attempted to pull it back over her. She was frightened, but stubbornly continued to clutch at the coverlet, and soon it became a tug of war in the pitch black bedroom. There was a stronger than usual jerk, and she heard a hollow, spectral voice of a woman close near the bed. "Give me back my quilt. It was my Christmas gift." And then the voice said it again, said again, "Give it back now, or you will be sorry." Suddenly she fell back in bed. The tug at the other end had ceased abruptly. Convinced that she experienced a most extraordinary nightmare owing to fatigue from her long trip, she fell into a restless sleep. The following morning, the incident seemed too bizarre to tell her mother. A few nights later, as she lay awake, unable to sleep, she thought she felt the quilt move again. At first, it was almost unnoticeable, and then suddenly there was a convulsive wriggling and it slithered up around her shoulders and neck. And before she could move, the quilt with a whip-like movement drew itself over her face. Panic-stricken, Florence leapt from the bed. She turned on the hurricane lamp beside the table and settled herself in a chair in the corner of the room. The quilt lay on the bed in a pile where she had thrown it. She soon felt ridiculous. How could there be anything threatening about a blanket? She gradually became drowsy and was almost asleep when the hall clock struck 2 a.m. Rousing herself, she was ready to return to bed when ever so gently the triangles and squares began to ripple across the bed. As she stared in amazement, the quilt crept towards the head of the bed, straightened itself out, and covered it as smoothly as if it had never been used. At that moment, she heard a soft knock on the bedroom door, and she opened it, grateful, thinking that it was her mother. Instead, Florence saw the tall figure of a man. He wore a straw farmer's hat, and as he reached for her, a dank and putrid odor became almost overpowering. From the outstretched arms, her terrified gaze traveled upward towards the man's face, and when she looked under the broad brim of the hat, she nearly fainted. The figure standing before her had a face so bruised and discolored that it scarcely appeared human. Somehow she was able to slam the door and lock it, expecting to hear a pounding on the other side at any moment. Her heart thudded wildly in her chest, and the room grew dark around her. When morning arrived, Florence found herself lying across the bed with the quilt neatly folded beside the door. She never slept under that quilt again. Her fear of the quilt being in the same house with her became a phobia, and after relating the strange events to her mother, she was somewhat relieved. Nonetheless, they both knew that they would feel easier when the quilt was out of their house. What to do with it became something of a problem. Miss Monroe preferred to tell herself that her daughter had arrived in an overwrought state and that the bizarre events in her story were simply imagined. On the other hand, she was too knowledgeable a woman to give the quilt to a friend in a town as small as Kershaw, for if, and at this point, she would not let herself think any further on that subject. Several times she considered burning the quilt, but when she went to the linen closet to take it out, the bright colors almost seemed to glow in the dim light. She couldn't bring herself to destroy it. One afternoon, a young Midwesterner named Alfred Hanson stopped by for a few hours on his way to the South Carolina coast for vacation. The conversation turned to antiques, and on an impulse, Miss Monroe brought out the quilt for him to see. He admired it profusely. She was aware of Florence's agitation. Her face became flushed and her breath quickened, and she left the room. Her mother determined that the quilt had to go. Hanson was overwhelmed, but Miss Monroe recalled his helping Florence out of the water when she ventured too far the summer before. She urged him to accept the quilt as a gift. From the start, he had been tempted to give in, for he was greatly taken with it and had only protested out of courtesy and surprise. By the time he was ready to leave, Miss Monroe had prevailed. Several months later, a letter arrived for her. Her face grew pale as she read it. Then she handed it to Florence. December 24th, 1954. Dear Miss Monroe, since I visited your home, some most unusual events have occurred. In fact, I had not recently been checked by a physician, I would have been even more concerned over my present illness. The doctor, a new friend of mine, impresses one at first as a tall and gaunt, almost rough sort of fellow, but he's been very kind and reassuring. Under normal circumstances, I would most certainly begin this letter by thanking you for your generous gift of the quilt I so admired. At the moment, it's difficult for me to do so. Indeed, you may be surprised to learn I've even considered some means of destroying your gift. Please do not take offense at this, for I do not mean that I am in any way ungrateful. I have slept with the quilt over my bed almost every night that I am able, although sometimes when I awake in the morning I am weak with fatigue and drenched with sweat. I am convinced that I often wrestle with the quilt all night long. Does that seem strange to you? A quilt that moves? Yes, this is what I believe I have seen. I am wondering if it does not have an existence on its own. This probably sounds foolish to you. Of course, I had to describe my quilt to Dr. Gerber and showed it to him. When he saw it, all he could say was an admiring, "Oh, it's very beautiful." The poor man was so enamored of it that I even considered giving it to him. But for some reason, victory over this quilt has become something of an obsession with me, and I swear, although it may sound absurd, that I shall come out on top. A little pun, I guess. Well, perhaps you will bear with my wanderings. I am not feeling well tonight, and I have just called Dr. Gerber, who will be here very soon. Actually, I humored the good man, telling him that if anything were to happen to me, my housekeeper has been told that he is to have the quilt. He laughed, saying that my illness was certainly not fatal. Please forgive the smudge on the paper. As I wrote, the light in my room went out. Now I've gotten back on. And where is the quilt at the moment? It's on my bed, of course. I have it just over my knees. No, this should prove to you that it can move. It's now almost up to my neck. Oh, my God. And there the letter to Miss Monroe ended, and enclosed was a brief note. I am forwarding Hance's letter to you, written just before his attack. Undoubtedly, his hallucinations resulted in the unconscious state in which I found him. At my recommendation, he is left for a rest and a change of scene. He insisted on giving his quilt to me, which, pathetically enough, the poor fellow believes to have been a factor in his illness. Respectfully, John Gerber. The letters and the signature were tall and flowing. Dora Monroe sat down and wrote to Alfred Hanson. 3 months passed, and there was still no reply. She decided to call and discovered Hanson's telephone had been disconnected. On impulse, she asked the operator for the number of a Dr. John Gerber. We have a Hans Gerber and a Eugene Gerber. Could it be one of those? No. Well, ma'am, I'm checking, and we don't have any record for there ever being a Dr. John Gerber in this town.